Welcome to a program exploring the Alexander technique. And the Alexander technique is really one of the approaches that are in the field of somatics. And somatics really looks at mind, body, body, mind, how body impacts the mind. It's so interesting that in much of our thinking, we mainly think of our thoughts, our emotions affecting body. But the data is clear that 80% of the vagal activity from our GI tract and our bodies goes to our brain. So we are programmed and impacted by how our bodies are. Every thought, every emotion has a corresponding body activity, and every body activity has a corresponding thought and emotions. That's called the psychophysiological principle. And another theme of this whole world is that function develops structure, and structure develops function, or constrains function, really. And what I mean by that is how you're using yourself changes the physiological, muscular structure, but also the neural connections in your brain. And if you don't use them, you lose them. The proverbial phrase, use it or lose it. It's, as you say in neurology, neurons that fire together, wire together. And how we use ourselves cause the neurons to wire together. The theme of all this is how do we deal with health and dysfunctioning? And what is so interesting is that there are really two conceptual approaches to that. There are really artificial separations. I call them a structural approach or a functional approach. And a structural approach tends to look at health or illness, especially illness, as something that is structurally broken and needs to be fixed almost externally. For example, a classic one would be in type 1 diabetes, where the pancreas no longer makes insulin. That's definitely a structural issue. You probably need or must use some versions of insulin to be able to metabolize the sugars and carbohydrates. There's no other option easily. However, in many cases, it's much more complex. I may have a back pain, and the back pain could be structural. I could have been hit by a car. In many cases, it's really the result of how we use ourselves. And thus, treatments depend on our perspective. If we see the illness as structural, it means usually a practitioner will do something to the person to try to put it right, or the practitioner will give some form of medications to either supplement what's missing in the body. And let me give two kinds of examples. One, let's say I have back pain. A structural approach, although I'm being totally unfair to probably the practitioners, is where I would say, the spinal alignment is incorrect. I now go to a chiropractor. He or she readjusts it. And when they readjust it, I'm all well. And in many cases, that works superbly. However, if my spinal problem is really due how I'm using myself, how I sit at the computer and I bend forward, or how I talk and I get scared, then moments later during the day, I fall right back into that dysfunctional state. And thus the structural approach is really insufficient and not helpful. A similar approach in this way would be like in depression. I could think of depression as possibly a structural approach where somehow the neurotransmitters, the dopamine, makes a difference which one are too low or too high. And from a structural approach, you would now give the person some form of antidepressant medication. However, there's a whole other approach to think of all this, and that is a functional approach. That's saying how you're using yourself will be changing the structure over time. And let me give an example first with depression and then with the back pain. If I think of depression, a functional approach would be saying the way I stand, the way I think, how I process myself, the whole part of cognitive therapy, that if I start thinking differently, perceive the world differently, then I'm changing the neurotransmitters. And in fact, my depression may decrease. This has a long history already since the 1960s, where you can really see that cognitive therapy is a powerful tool to reduce depression. And if you combine this with a functional approach of physical activity and exercise, in most cases, if not almost all cases, it works significantly better than the antidepressant medications. And in the same way, a functional approach to the back pain, is teaching you somehow how to sit and be different and use yourself differently so the body does not collapse and slowly learns how to extend and widen and be more in optimum function. Now, this can apply to many disorders. And I strongly recommend that we think of a functional approach first, because that allows us to regain health. And obviously it's done in conjunction with sometimes structural approaches as well. I was first introduced to the Alexander technique in 1971 in New York by Judy Leibowitz. She came to our house, and there we were exchanging information. I was talking about biofeedback, how we worked, and how we used that to potentially work for people with headaches or just to teach awareness, where you use sensors on the body. And she, a much older woman, unbelievably skillful, used her hands and had a whole process and skill set, which I knew nothing about, called the Alexander technique. And then she demonstrated it on me. She said, Eric, sit in the chair. I sat in the chair. She gently put her hands on my jaw, on my neck, almost not touching at all. She had the softest hands. Then she gave me some instructions. I moved back and forth. And then as I stood up, I just floated out of the chair, literally. It took no effort. What she had done, looking back at those moments, she had guided me in such a way, in a way with tactile and word instructions, how to move without eliciting the alarm or startle response. It made such a giant difference. Something it's hard to forget. It was so different. And as I became aware of more of the literature and the teaching of this, I realized that this approach is an educational approach. It's really a way to teach people how to optimize their health. In a way, I would say how to inhibit the startle reaction, how to be totally present during movement. And movement, remember, is who we are. And in fact, our brain, we forget that probably was developed, our nervous system was developed because we need to learn to coordinate. If we don't need to coordinate our bodies, multicellular organisms don't need a nervous system. So movement is intrinsic to the development of our brain. And the Alexander technique is aware of this whole concept and then uses how we move, how we are in the world to transform not only our bodies, transform our cognitions, emotions, and our presence in the world. Now, without much ado, I feel so honored to introduce Elise Schaffer. She is on the faculty at the American Conservatory Theater Studio Program. She has taught at Berkeley Rep to the actors, and also the faculty at San Francisco State, where she teaches a course on somatics and the Alexander technique. And also, she has a private practice teaching the Alexander technique as an educator in San Francisco and Berkeley. And she's even an alumni of San Francisco State, which I didn't even realize, that she got a master's degree in physiological psychology in a few years ago only, where she studied the scientific underpinning of the mind-body connection and conducted original research on the Alexander technique, how to reduce muscle tension for people sitting at the computer. Elise, such pleasure for you taking the time.
I'm so happy to be here, Eric, and that was a really wonderful introduction to the Alexander technique. I particularly like that you brought up the comparison to cognitive behavioral therapy, because cognitive behavioral therapy is based on recognizing thought habits that are harmful to your health, that are repetitive, that are overly negative, learning how to stop those habits, and then reframe the situation with thoughts that are more accurate and more productive. And that particular form of therapy, as we well know, has been supported by numerous research studies over the years to be very effective. That is pretty much the exact process that an Alexander student would use, except with their posture and their body awareness. They would become aware of movement habits that are harmful, dysfunctional, that have excess stress and strain on their body that cause pain. With that heightened degree of awareness, they learn how to stop those habits and how to replace them with literally thoughts that then change the way they move. So you get a kind of effortless, natural alignment that you then carry through in the rest of your life. So the analogy was perfect. You use awareness, you use stopping, and you use mental direction to make change.
Elise, as you're a teacher of this technique, I'm really intrigued, how did this technique ever get developed? How did Alexander develop this strange, touching technique?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Frederick Matthias Alexander, or FM as he was known by his students, he was born in 1869 in Tasmania. And he was actually, as a young man, he was introduced to Shakespeare and fell in love with acting, and eventually became what today might be known as a spoken word artist or a solo theater artist. He was going around Australia being very successful as a Shakespearean orator, reciting, and he started to have vocal problems. He started to go hoarse on stage, and he was taking a structural approach to that, going to doctors and saying, what medications do I need to take? What do I need to do to stop myself from going hoarse? And none of the doctors could come up with a cure. The only thing that helped Alexander was actually vocal rest. So this was in the 1890s, and he came up with, at the time, what was a creative leap, which was, there must be something that I'm doing while I'm performing which is causing my vocal issues. And he very cleverly set up mirrors, 3 mirrors, front, side, and back, so he could observe himself from all angles, and watched what he was doing as he was speaking. And today he would have just used his phone camera. And he noticed that when he would recite a line of Shakespeare, he would lift his chest, take in a large gasping breath, push his neck forward, pull his head back, raise his shoulders, and then start to speak. And, for people in the audience or watching this video, you might actually want to try doing that. So take a large gasping breath, lift your chest, lift your shoulders, push your neck forward, pull your head back, and notice, what emotion does this feel like? Can you breathe? Does it feel good? So he saw this habit in the mirror and was kind of shocked because he didn't know that he was doing it, and immediately concluded that there was something about his unconscious way of breathing when he was performing which was causing his vocal problems, and it was probably connected to his emotional state, to being nervous. Yes, Eric.
Or the example you gave was superb, or how he discovered it. I thought maybe if the person watching the video, if you do the following, you may want to do it as well. So do just what you did. You take this gasp, you pull back, and now start speaking. And then you see, hello, how are you? And listen how the voice is. And now stop. Now be more tall, and now breathe lower. And now speak. Hello, how are you? And what at least I experience when I do this kind of purposeful oppositional way of doing it, that the second one, my voice is lower. I feel much less tension inside. And I find for students, it's a great way to remember when to be more powerful if the voice is lower, a tiny bit lower, we do much better. And that's really what you've just described.
Absolutely. I've seen this breathing pattern described, that Alexander had described as vertical breathing, where you're kind of doing that as opposed to the deep diaphragmatic belly breathing that we know supports health and relaxation. And, I worked for many, many years in American Conservatory Theater's MFA acting program, and all of the voice teachers, their mission was to get the students to relax their bellies so that they could breathe low and wide and also access their emotions, because if you're very tight, your emotional range is somewhat limited by a state of anxiety. So that is how he discovered the technique. And, often when I introduce students in a workshop, I go through a couple of Alexander's.
Can I stop for a sec? Is that okay?
Yeah.
We just got to the point where Alexander had just used the mirrors. How long did it take him? What did he do? And how did the technique develop?
Yes, great question. So the lore is that he spent about 10 years. Actually, researchers think it was 3, but he was working as a clerk, and every day after work, he would go home and he would get in front of his mirrors and he'd practice for a couple of hours. He was really, really internally motivated by his desire to return to the stage as an actor. And he didn't know that he was developing a famous somatic method at the time. And so he started studying himself in the mirror, and he realized that he couldn't really change this pattern. It seemed to be inextricably linked to the act of speaking. But somehow, if he could shift the way that his head balanced on his spine, that started to change his alignment and his breath. And there were several discoveries that he made that had to do with both directing alignment and also working with how he reacted emotionally and physically to the impulse to speak. And maybe I could just take watchers, viewers, through a couple of examples just to get a sense of that.
Great.
So any instruction that I'm giving you, you want to do with the least amount of effort possible, because one of the things that Alexander discovered initially was that a sense of effort and a strong desire to succeed tended to cause a lot of muscle tension. He had to have a kind of carefree, easygoing, light attitude, okay? So what's very helpful for people to do is to find where their head balances on the top of their spine. And a lot of times we get a little distracted by the face and we sort of think the top of our neck is like chin level. If that's your idea, you're missing about 4 vertebrae. So to find the top of your head, you want to maybe put your fingers, and get that in the screen, in your ears, and imagine there's a little string between your fingertips. And then if you gently nod your head as though you're saying yes, you are moving your head up and over the very top vertebra of your spine. You can also feel that by putting one hand on your nose and one hand on the back of your head and doing a kind of little dipping bird yes movement. And that is such a helpful thing, because when you do that, you are lengthening. I'm going to get into a side view here. You're lengthening the back of your neck and letting the top of your head be at the tallest place away from your tailbone. So Alexander was in this kind of posture with his neck forward and his head back, and he discovered that he could relax these tense muscles at the back of his neck. He said, free them. And with that, the head would delicately rotate forward, which lengthened the back of the head and lifted the crown up off the spine. So he got...
Elise, you gave a perfect demonstration how we could see, in fact, you became taller all over against your background. And I want to just emphasize that most people don't realize when they think of getting taller, they think of getting taller by lifting their eyes up, and then they think they're taller, but in fact, they're shrinking because now they're contracting their neck. And it was such a great example. I could see it just against your trees in the background.
Trees are a great metaphor. And what I want to emphasize for people is that this is not a position that you hold, because if you hold your head stiffly in a position like a statue or what people tend to think of as posture, you will become stiff. You will have a hard time breathing and reacting. So this is not a position. It's a dynamic relationship between your neck, your head, and your back that is always slightly moving and shifting and creating freedom. And what you're doing as an Alexander practitioner or student is you are just making sure that you are not getting stuck in a kind of unhealthy, uncomfortable position. And when you undo that, you are kind of coming into a relationship which is taller, lighter, freer, more open, where you can breathe better. So that's like sort of the first discovery that Alexander made, that the head balance seemed to have a kind of controlling impact on the rest of your body. A really quick example I like to give is that if you've ever kind of woken up with a stiff knee or a stiff hip, it's very uncomfortable. It might change the way you move, but it does not compare to waking up with a stiff neck. When you wake up with a stiff neck, it turns you into Frankenstein. Every single joint below that neck is totally rigid, and you move really, really carefully to not disturb that stiff neck. And basically, that's an extreme example of what I would say most people are walking around with all the time, that they have a slightly stiffened neck that is inhibiting the freedom of their breathing and their movement throughout their life. And by unstiffening up there, it creates a kind of global freedom. Doesn't mean that we ignore the rest of the body. Yes, Eric.
Well, another way of saying it is that without knowing, as little babies or little children, unknowingly, we tend to give startle or fear responses in things. And then that's a kind of pattern where I tighten a bit. I don't even know I do it. And then that gets conditioned in all our behaviors, in our movements. And what Alexander then did, he somehow was aware of this process and he taught people to inhibit that. And then they would have total free movement. Is that what you mean?
That is what I mean. And inhibition tends to be a really strange word for people who are looking to feel free. It's not a Freudian inhibition. It's a recognition that you are having some kind of response or reaction that is not effective, that is not desirable. And so you choose to stop that reaction. And when you stop that reaction, literally your kind of natural alignment that you were born with as an infant, if you look at little kids, they tend to be very upright, their heads are very free, their posture is very tall, they're very loose. And it's only when they start to have, a lot of the stresses at school, of socialization, of learning to write, that they start to get kind of compressed, and that gets learned, but you can unlearn it.
Now, Elise, it sounds very nice, but how do you work as an Alexander teacher to teach someone how to change their pattern, which seems so embedded in all their behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. And all of these patterns tend to be completely invisible to people from a feeling sense until you start to have pain or dysfunction, or you look at a picture of yourself and go, oh my God, or some teacher in a movement modality says, you're out of alignment. People tend not to be able to feel their habits. So in an Alexander technique lesson, usually I teach hands-on lessons where I touch people very lightly, and the touch feedback creates awareness about where the parts are in space, and I gently guide them during movement. But there's a lot of thinking that goes on, and the first layer of thinking is to be able to notice things happening in your body. The second layer is to learn how to stop those things from happening. And then the third layer is to be able to, just like the cognitive behavioral therapy, to be able to direct your thinking, your movement in a new direction. So one of the ways that we teach this in an Alexander lesson is getting in and out of a chair, because it's a movement where people tend to jerk their heads and necks and bodies in a way which is pretty inefficient. And can I go ahead and just guide people through doing that? Yes. Okay. So if you go ahead and sit in a chair, and then you pretend that the doorbell is ringing, the UPS guy is coming, and you go ahead and stand up. You want to just see if you can do it as normally, but notice what's happening in your neck, your head, and your back. And the question you're asking yourself is, am I doing something like that, which is what Alexander did? Or am I letting my head float off my back and moving in a more free fashion? So let's see. Why don't you try it, Eric?
I'm cheating because I have, I'm sort of aware of the process.
Yeah, Eric's had plenty of Alexander training and has also worked for many, many years as a, biofeedback person with his.
What it reminded me of is that an easy way to become aware, because I found when I first did this, I was really unaware what was going on. I didn't know it. And having a teacher, their tactile feedback and verbal instructions was helpful. And then now it's easier because I can put my cell phone to the side at 45 degrees or 90 degrees. And then I can get up and then I can look at my own head-neck relationship as an analyst. And that may be a very good way how people can become aware how, in fact, they're getting in and out of a chair.
Absolutely. Today we have the video feedback that Alexander lacked, so you can watch yourself. But you can also put your hand on the back of your neck and just notice if you feel a lot of muscle engagement, if you feel your head pulling back as you get up. You also might notice if you are lifting your shoulders or really pushing down with your hands. There might be a lot of different patterns that are going on. So the first layer is just to observe, what are my daily habits in life? And if you think about how many times you get in and out of a chair, which is, hundreds in a day, that pattern is probably ingrained in the way that you do everything. So that's the first layer. The second layer is to actually practice this idea of stopping or inhibition. So it can be kind of interesting to just sit there and pretend that the doorbell is ringing, that you have to get up. And without standing, just starting to notice the really subtle muscle activations that just occur to get you out of the chair. You've probably never noticed that before. No one ever thinks about standing, you're just up. But Eric, do you notice anything starting to happen in your body?
Well, when I do this, if I almost at the initiation of movement, I can feel my tightening in my thighs and buttocks, sometimes depending how quick I want to be, it's almost like my knees want to almost come back together to get up.
Yeah.
And yet I almost have not moved at all yet.
Right. So there's some kind of preparatory wave of action. And of course, you do need to move muscles to move. But then what happens if you imagine the doorbell's ringing, you think, I've got to get up, and then you actually tell yourself, you know what? I'm free not to. I'm free to just continue sitting here. I'm not going to stand up. And you just notice if some of those waves of preparatory action subside. So then the trick in the Alexander work is, well, how do I move without all of those get ready responses? And the answer to that would be to use a process of direction, or sometimes you might think of it as motor imagery or visualization. And so I'm going to just teach you a couple of images. So the first thought we want to have is as though there's a tiny, like if you put your fingertips, I'm losing my image here in the camera, if you put your fingertips in your ears and you imagine at the center of your head, there's like a tiny little golden rocking chair, and you just imagine that little chair rocking. That's a little image for finding the most subtle and delicate movement of your head at the top of your spine. And if you find that you're using a lot of muscular effort to pull your chin back or to jam your head down, don't do that. So some facts that are helpful: your head is a little heavier in the front than in the back, so it wants to kind of nod forward with gravity. And if you imagine your neck like you're in a warm shower, you could go ahead and kind of put your hands and sort of brush down the sides of your neck. And you just imagined you're in a warm shower and there's warm water flowing down your neck and down your shoulders and down your back and down your arms, and just carrying any tension out of the back of your neck and your throat. You might notice just from thinking that your head feels a little lighter and freer. And with that thought, then you just imagine a little nod of your nose. So you're giving two directions. I'm allowing my neck to be free. I'm allowing my head to float and rotate a little on the top of my spine. And so then you can use that thought to get out of the chair. So you think the doorbell's ringing. You take a moment to think, nope, I'm not going to get up and get it. I'm going to let all that get ready tension leave my body. I'm going to imagine the muscles in my neck melting and lengthening. I'm going to let my head rock a little bit forward. And that little rocking is probably enough to just tip you forward onto your feet and pour you up out of the chair. So that might be a process that you would start to learn, and it would be the same action coming down. Now, how'd that feel to you, Eric?
Well, when I go up, it took much less effort, like I was totally unaware of the tension in my legs or anything. It's like it's really just doing this. It just, when I tilted my head more forward, as if I felt myself falling forward in a certain way and then coming up.
Yeah, it's like falling upwards.
Yes.
So, it's not that the Alexander technique is teaching you the right way to get in and out of a chair. It's not about positions or stereotyped movements, but it is about teaching students how to find the most natural and efficient movements of their bones and joints, and also how to kind of move to strip away that extra preparatory tension, which causes stiffness, breath holding, and emotional discomfort. So, and you learn that through becoming aware of your habits, learning how to decide not to engage in them, which is really a mental decision, and then learning some ideas of freedom that will help you. I would love to just teach people a couple hand gestures that they can, or a couple ways that they can create a feeling of direction in their body, a little bit like what a teacher would give, not as sophisticated and subtle, but something that you could do for yourself. So the first thought that we learn in the Alexander technique is to allow the neck to be free. And if you put your fingertips on your sternum and you brush along these long muscles called the sternocleidomastoid muscles, these muscles will often get very short and tight on people. If you just lightly brush kind of up and back, and you just sort of think neck free and back. It's almost like you're kind of making a question mark shape as you brush back along from your sternum, back along your neck, and up and over your head. And you're thinking neck free and back, and that head delicately nodding a little bit forward and floating up. If you do that a couple times, you just notice how you feel. Neck free and back, head floating forward and up. There might be a little quality of lightness, and then you put your fingertips back on your sternum, and you can brush out along your collarbones, and just think collarbones free and wide. A lot of the times our tension is from, we kind of pull in or squeeze or even pull back, and you just want those collarbones to float and widen, and they can kind of think like big arrows out to the side. My hands are disappearing off the screen. And you can think collarbones free and wide. Neck free and back. Head delicately forward and up. Collarbones free and wide. And you just pause. Neck free and back. Head delicately nodding forward and up. Collarbones free and wide. You just notice how you feel. You notice your breathing. You notice your back. There would be more as we would learn about the spine and the back and the legs and the knees. But you just think, could I carry on with this ease as I was working at a computer, as I was, while driving, while at a business meeting, while having a heated talk with a loved one, during taking a test, studying, you start to learn how to insert a little bit more ease into your everyday actions.
What you really described in some ways is a kind of somatic meditational practice during the way, because at that moment, instead of being preoccupied by anything, I just focus and be with this sense of awareness, and touch is very helpful to remind you and almost interrupt your thoughts. And now you have almost like a mantra going, in the same way giving directionality. And so it's a very lovely way, a kind of a mindfulness with the instructions you would say, as well as, if you get captured by something else, let that go and go right back to this practice.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. It's kind of, the touch highlights, it makes your body map more accurate. So your brain is more accurately aware of where parts of you are in space. It helps you come into the present moment because, again, we're looking at that mind-body connection. So, when you're worrying about the future, you're worrying in your brain, you're also worrying in your body. It's the same thing. So, as you come into the present moment with your thoughts, you realize you're doing the best you can to handle the situations. You've done the work. Here you are, and you don't need to carry that worry, stress, or the worry thoughts forward. Not saying that's easy, it's a practice.
What I just noticed for myself is when I did the practice that you guided through, that at the end I may have let it have a slight tension in my shoulders. So what I purposely did is I let my hands just drop to my lap and allowed my shoulders also to drop and almost feel them drop even more.
Right, absolutely. And this would be, on some level, there's a layer of deep subtlety because I just had people go for it and do a movement. But if I was really teaching this as an Alexander process, I would have them notice how they got ready to do this practice. Was there a slight tension in the shoulders? What happens if you let that go and you just lead with your fingertips and you let your hands follow your fingertips? So there's a lot there.
So in a sense, you guide us through, in a way, an idea how to get out of a chair by almost inhibiting the startle response, I would say, by letting the head, go almost on a very rocky chair, go slightly looser, go forward and up and let it go down so you get up. But, much of my world is other things. I go to the bathroom, I brush my teeth, I cook. What about all those other things? I work at a computer. What can I do then? Or for what is it good anyway?
Right, absolutely. So the getting out of the chair is just one of, I would almost say like billions of different movement options that the human animal is going to encounter in their everyday life. But the process is the same. So brushing your teeth is a great one because people often, there's a lot of extra force that's probably not needed. And so the first step might actually be to get out there in front of your mirror and notice, what am I doing when I'm brushing my teeth? Is it necessary for me to push my neck forward, to tighten my jaw, to really grip the toothbrush with a death grip? What happens if so you notice all those habits, you pause before you do them, you make a mental decision, can I do a little bit less? Can I let my neck be free? Can I let my head float forward and up? Can I let my back lengthen and widen? You take the toothbrush up, and as you bring it to your mouth, you're like noticing, oh, it's getting closer. I'm getting into that zone where I really want to do something, and you work with those habits. So you're sticking with allowing your body to move in a free way. And that would pretty much apply to any single, any action. You're working at your computer and you're all like crunched up, and you kind of notice that, wow, I'm really crunched up. Well, is it possible for me to do this work without the crunch? So you let go of some tension. Well, I still haven't really lengthened, but I'm a lot less tense. Here, I'm just kind of crunching forward here. And, well, what happens if in this crunched position I noticed first, I'm not even making a physical change. I'm just noticing a little bit what's going on mentally and emotionally. I'm emotionally tense. I'm mentally worrying. What if I just come into the present moment? I stop. I realize I'm doing what I can. I think in this position to let my neck be free and my head float and my back lengthen and widen, and maybe there's a little coming up onto the sit bones. Maybe there's adjusting the screen a little bit. There might be some movements that you need to do, but you come out of the compression, and you come out of it not just as a position, but with an awareness of what is going on mentally and emotionally that's taking you into the compression. Oops, here's my cat. Let me move.
Well, and then I would even say afterwards is that as you become aware, you may just notice the screen is not quite in focus. You may need new glasses, or your keyboard is too high or too low. Or if you're working on a laptop, it's almost impossible, because if my laptop is on the table, I almost have to always be collapsed in order to see the screen. So I need to apply all the ergonomic corrections to optimize that space around me as well.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of, learning in the Alexander technique how to arrange your skeletal structure in a way where you're poised, you're mechanically balanced, there's a sense of ease, it's not stiff or held. But I would add to that, Alexander technique is used a lot in the performing arts. I worked for years with actors, and not every role an actor is going to be playing is going to look like they have perfect poise and alignment. So there is something about learning how, in any shape that you're in, to create some internal space and flow of direction, so that there's a lot of flexibility and mobility, as opposed to trying to hit something that looks like a statue that's rigid.
So if I think as you have described it, then I would think, the question I would ask is, for what is the Alexander technique useful? And if I did it in a very simplistic way, I could think of 2 or 3 different broad categories. One, any illness or dysfunction where stress could be a cofactor, because that automatically, it's a triggering of the alarm reaction. And whether that caused the illness or aggravates the illness, at least the technique may be able to reduce it. 2 is where the person has learned, without awareness usually, although functional when they probably learned it, some extra bracing or misdirected efforts in doing tasks. Or if they've had surgery or other things that they have learned not to use certain musculature and compensate it. Are there other categories where you think this could be useful, or in a very broad way, and then maybe give a few specifics?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, any kind of physical, obviously, stress-related disease, but there's a lot of stress-related physical pain that people experience. There's kind of a positive feedback between emotional stress and physical tension. Also, for people who've been injured, there tends to be both trauma patterns in the body, bracing, but also mental fear around using the injured parts. So there's a lot of work with kind of coming out of injuries. Same thing with back pain. People who've had chronic back pain, they may learn better structural uses, but they might have a lot of anxieties about moving. So Alexander technique is very good for reestablishing trust in the body, reducing pain. It tends to make movement much more efficient and easy. So, people people often will start exercising more after doing Alexander technique. Let me pause for a second. So broad categories would be pain, performance, stress. Definitely there's a kind of body image category or self-confidence, self-presentation. People also come because they have Alexander's original issue. They have voice problems, they have vocal strain. I've worked with not just performers, but teachers, people who have to talk professionally for a living. It's very helpful for work with breathing. It's so funny. My entire life is about the Alexander technique, and it's hard to think simply about why would someone use it. I came to it because I was a dancer and I was having a lot of physical dysfunction and pain and emotional stress and anxiety. And the Alexander technique was this magic solution that both calmed my mind, relaxed my body, and improved the way I moved. Like, it literally gave me much more skill and performance to a kind of shocking degree, actually. I mean, and I think, people, I'm now middle-aged, and I'm finding that, it's useful for, continuing to maintain a very youthful, fluid, physical presence. People use it for healthy aging.
It just reminded me in a humorous way, like driving a car. If you think our bodies, when we drive our cars efficiently, and when we come to a stoplight, we slowly press the brake, we do it smoothly, and then when it turns green, you gently accelerate. The car lasts a long time. But if I do it, I go at full speed till the red light, slam the brake down, and then really press the gas pedal going off at the green light. Those are major stressors for the car, but in our bodies it's the same way. When I move, and I just almost, not that you shouldn't jump up, but you jump with too much inappropriate efforts, then you're as if you're putting a brake on at the same time, and that may give much more wear on the joints. It may lead to much more stiffness. And so it is remarkable for flexibility and a kind of smoothness, looseness, youthness in movement. What I think what is so hidden in the Alexander technique and so obvious in many ways is that when we are anxious, our bodies change. And if your body isn't anxious, your brain cannot be anxious. And it's the same way for many. And that is the hidden message, that by letting the body be totally free or quiet, then the brain can only be free and quiet. If the body is tightened, then simultaneously we evoke those memories of stress or whatever it may be. We don't even know we do it. And the Alexander technique is an approach in a kind of somatic therapy or somatic re-education to free the body. So it also allows the mind and emotions to be free.
That was, for me, where the technique was the most powerful. And I think people are aware that they have physical tension, and they're aware that they have mental tension, but they're not, and they're aware that they're linked, but they are not aware that there is something that they can do about that. And often the solution is basically just based on the mental component. And then they might go for a massage, which is great, not to diss that, for the physical component, but they don't realize that in their everyday living, they can work with both components simultaneously, and there is a quality of peace, ease, and alertness that you can carry through your life, which, I don't know, it's unique. I have to say, it's a pretty unique technique.
Elise, could you describe for people when a person would come for an Alexander lesson, how would it be a little bit structured if possible? And overall, I know people are all individual. Would you want to do it just one day, or do you do it for 2 years or 3 months? I think that would be helpful to give a flavor, because so few people are aware of this.
Yeah, so generally when people come in, the first lesson is a little bit longer than average. It's about an hour, and there's a period where we're just chatting, and the person is telling me in more detail why they've come. And as they're talking to me, I'm essentially noticing a lot. I'm noticing how they're breathing, how they're sitting, what they're doing with their bodies as they're talking. I'm basically doing my assessment of their body as we're sitting and talking. And then, the actual structure of an individual lesson will vary. A very typical thing to do in a first lesson, though, is to practice that getting in and out of a chair movement where I am guiding them with my hands so that they're experiencing a kind of smoothness and a lack of effort. And they're also starting to notice the link between their thoughts and their muscle tension. So they start to make those really basic discoveries. And then we might do some walking. And then there's also in a lesson a table session where they lie down fully clothed, and I'm using my hands to bring awareness to kind of invisible tensions and to guide their thinking so that they're starting to learn how to direct or think into their body with intention so that everything starts to open up and flow. Or as one teacher said, I just get my students to melt. So there's a kind of melting of tension. So that might be a first lesson. From then on, lessons would vary to, we would start working on whether the person has pain or, pain in different areas, or wants to perform certain movements differently, or has certain very, postural things that need to kind of come into more alignment. The bare minimum of study, I would say, would be 6 lessons, and that's actually supported by a 2008 study that was published in the British Medical Journal that showed that a combination of 6 one-on-one Alexander Technique lessons combined with walking had a pretty dramatic impact on chronic lower back pain. The reality, though, is that because we are dealing with pretty subtle habits that you learn over your life, most people benefit from more than 6 lessons. So I usually say to students, come for about 15 lessons. It's about a semester of college. Come once a week. I'll give you things to work on. Usually that is enough that people will leave with awareness of their habits and the skill to make that change. That said, I have students who've, been with me for, 12, 15, 18 years. Some people, get so invested in the technique that it becomes kind of part of their life self-maintenance. They don't come every week, but it's part of their process. And, sometimes people stay for a year or 2 or 5 years. So not to scare you off, but, that's very individual. But a lot of people find that the process is essential to their self-development and growth. And I will just say that the reason I trained to be an Alexander Technique teacher is that I was so intrigued by how my automatic tensions interfered with my functioning. I felt like there was almost no point in me trying to learn other things until I could learn to untangle my own patterns of interference. And I think a lot of people get very interested in that process.
Yeah, I think the remarkable part is it's not quite asking why. The Alexander teacher looks at how the system is coordinated almost. It then helps give the person directions to allow change to occur. And then hopefully during the day, one becomes aware, oops, I'm reacting. I can now give myself the directionality to interrupt. And the more I do that, the more likely will health be optimized.
Yeah. I mean, students are always coming back reporting like, the chronic pain in my shoulder went away as soon as I practiced this unspiraling in the bicep thought that we were working on in lessons. It's like students are leaving with all kinds of practical bits of knowledge that they can use to come out of pain and feel better in their everyday life.
Yes, I'm always so impressed that the technique is not really aimed as a quote treatment for a specific disorder, but really as a way to optimize the health. And in that sense, the illness hopefully will fade away or disappear because you have gotten rid of the dysfunctional patterning both in body and in a way in mind. if I'm interested in learning more about the Alexander technique or finding a teacher, what would you recommend? How can I find a resource?
Okay. So there is an organization called the American Society for Alexander Technique, AMSAT. You can look that up online. And the American Society for the Alexander Technique has a Find a Teacher page. So you can look up teachers who've gone through 1,600 hours, 3 years worth of training, near your zip code, and find someone to work with one-on-one. Sometimes there are group classes offered. So for example, in the Bay Area, I offer a class at Studio ACT, which anyone can take in San Francisco by going to the ACT website. You can also come see me in San Francisco in my private practice office by looking me up online. And should I share my website?
Please do.
So this is actually, that's my office in San Francisco. And I'm located, you can give me a call, or you can send me an email, or you can look me up on the web. And there are many other teachers in the Bay Area. We're blessed to be richly populated with Alexander Technique teachers. And feel free to email me if you have questions.
Well, Elise, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and guiding us through some very, I will almost say simple, but very potent and powerful self-awareness practices, and showing that change is possible